Aye.
And etch the photograph in wood. And then like Lou said, let's say you want to do a photograph of lucite, you do it on the back reverse. So if the front is smooth and you can clean it and, you know what I mean?
Have something to drink.
I will. So that's what I got into.
Beautiful, fantastic. Ernie, who else have enough?
I'll have ginger ale. Diet.
Your wife only buys diet. Everything here is diet.
Only diet here.
Good evening, everybody. We left off on page 229. I think Bernie's here.
Wait 1 minute. let me get
Maybe
there.
Bernie.
There's another one.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Trip.
Thank you so
Fine.
much.
Who is it?
Is that Bernie?
Yes.
Hi, Bernie.
Sounds like Bernie. How you doing, Bernie?
Nice to see you recovered there, Saul.
I was here last
Nice
week
to have
too.
you here, what?
Yeah, he was here last week.
Where was I?
You sat here last week, remember?
So who was that? Gerard.
Gerard's not. here.
Gerard.
Gerard has a cold. He sent me
So we're
he said he's on
fortunately
Zoom.
He didn't send any germs.
Right. We're on page 229. We dealt with erva. So now what about erva for women? It means we said that last week we dealt with the laws that if a man wants to say Kriya Shema, there's certain erva. He cannot recite erva in front of a woman who's unclothed, if her hair is uncovered, she's singing. And we had his own erva, right? He has to have libo. Libo cannot, the heart and the erva cannot be in the same domain. So do these halachas apply to women who recite Kriya Shema or Tefillah or brachos, as well as to men, or maybe or women? Or can we be more lenient regarding the laws of erva regarding women? The Ramah writes that the rule of tefach bisha erva applies to women as well, at least according to the Rosh. Therefore, according to the Ramah, a woman may not recite a bracha or daven when standing in front of another woman whose body is exposed as defined by halacha.
Why would you assume that it should be different?
Because there are svaris in halacha that a man's yetzer is stronger, that he is diverted by his. I can see where they may have had that havamina. Not that women don't have those urges; they may not be as strong as men. So that was a havamina, but the Ramah rejects it. The Ramah says no. It's got the same din. Says the Ramah. This is we're still in Kriya Shema, right? Orach Chaim Ayin Hey. Nira medivrei harosh. The tefach beisha erva filas. It means the revealing a tefach of an erva by another woman affects another woman's reading Kriya Shema. Rak sheba'atzmei chol likros al pi shehu hi aruma. There is an nafkamina. A woman by herself can read Kriya Shema even if she's not clothed. There is no, remember, we said by a male, you can't do that. You have to have your erva covered. But the Ramah says she can read Kriya Shema even if she's aruma. even if she's not clothed. On the other hand, the Mishnah Berurah notes that the Rashba disagrees with this, and many Achronim adopt the Rashba as the practical halacha. Aval Rashba choylek al ze v'tamo. His reason is the sphere le dechi hechi de ba'atzma yichol likros kishiaruma. Since I guess the accepted din is that a woman can read Kriyat Shema if she's naked for herself. Alma de ein b'gilui kol gufa mishum v'lo yer b'chayvas davar. So there is no erva even with her whole body. Elula noshim. It's only erva for men. Umishum hirhur, because of they are going to have thoughts about that. Okay. Af isha acheres muteres likros ulehispal negda kishiaruma. So therefore, says the Rashba, another woman standing in front of a woman who's not clothed can read Kriyat Shema. Ulehispal negda kishiaruma. V'achronim maskimim ima Rashba. The later poskim agree with the Rashba. V'daitam de gamarosh moidel. They hold that even the Rosh admits to that. V'da od de lekulama ein muter likros negda kishi aruma rak kishi yosheves kadei shlo yeh paneh shelamata niris. The woman has to be sitting in a certain way that her genitalia are not exposed. Aval kishi omedes, when she's standing, dina kamo neged ervas ish, would be the same din as standing in front of the nakedness of a man. Vafilu b'shus acheres aser. And even if a woman is standing in a different location, different space, it would not be a heter to read Kriyat Shema there. Thus, the Mishnah Berurah argues that the consensus opinion holds that it is permitted for one woman to daven and recite brachas opposite another woman who is exposed. If she's entirely unclothed, then it remains permitted if she's sitting down. And furthermore, it's permitted for a woman who's not completely dressed to recite brachos herself. And even if she's unclothed, it is permitted as long as she's sitting. According to many opinions, this halacha also allows for a woman to recite the bracha upon immersion in the mikveh while she's in the water. The Alichos Bas Yisrael, which is a halachas for women, summarizes these halachas and adds two additional points. The issue of libo roes ha'erva technically doesn't apply to a woman, which we said before. And a woman may recite Shema when facing exposed portions of a man's body that are usually covered. Isha muteres lomer dvarim shebekdusha keneged isha acheres. She can say dvarim shebekdusha in front of another woman, she'ena levusha b'tznius, who's not dressed tzniistic, avalo keneged makam ha'erva mamish, but not in front of her. If the other woman's genitalia is exposed, she cannot read a davar shebekdusha. We said if the other woman is sitting, which then sort of conceals the makam ha'erva, then they can. Let's say her married friend is over her house, and she's not wearing her shaitel or hair covering. She can read a davar shebekdusha in front of the woman's hair that's uncovered. Umutra la meikar adin levarach l'spalak shein davar mafsik bein liba le'erva. Meikar adin, if she's not wearing if she's wearing a garment like a tunic, like we said, where the heart and the erva is in the same domain, she can daven and say brachas.
Does no woman say a bracha when she's in the mikveh and there's somebody watching?
So we just brought the fact that we said this, the halacha allows for a woman to recite the bracha upon immersion in the mikveh while she's in the water. Exactly that. Mashmos divrei poskim she'ein kol isur leisha likro kriyat shema levarach keneged mekomos haregilim lios b'chusim eitz la'ish. So we know a man also has areas of his body that should be covered. We're not talking about his erva. Of course, a woman would not be able to read Kriyat Shema neged the erva, but let's say his arms. A man's arms also have to be covered, or his legs, other parts of his body that normally are covered. So there, a woman can read Kriyat Shema against that. We cannot do the same against a woman because we're going to have hirhur, but they're not going to have hirhur. So the Mishnah Berurah, the Rashba holds that there is a difference in the sort of the character of a man versus a woman regarding this hear-her concept. Men will have more hear-her than women, and therefore they're not prohibited regarding those issues. 231, about Keri and Kriyat Shema. According to the Gemara, Ezra Soifer decreed that one who is ritually impure due to a seminal emission is forbidden from reciting words of Torah until he has immersed in a mikveh and become Tohar. The Gemara explains the rationale. If a Torah scholar knows that engaging in marital relations will render him a Balkari and require him to immerse before he can again speak words of Torah and recite brachos, he will refrain from excessively frequent marital relations. The Mishnah in Brachos records a machlokas tanoim regarding the scope of this restriction. Balkari mahar belibo, a Balkari can sort of think about Torah, but ve'enu mevarech cannot make a bracha lo lefanev lo lachrav. Ve'al hamazon mevarech la'achrav, he makes birchas hamazon after he eats. Ve'enu mevarech lefanev doesn't make a motzi. Rabbi Yeroim mevarech lefneim lachrav. Rashi enu mevarech afilu behirhur. When the Mishnah said, you can't think about it. And when we talked about lefanev lachra, we were talking about the brachos of Torah. Even the brachos lav midaraisa mechayev, since brachos are not required biblically, so we're talking about Kriyat Shema. So he doesn't do the blessings before Shema or the blessings after them. And Rashi says, these brachos are only rabbinic. So lav atzruchu rabbanon. So rabbanon didn't require him to say it. According to the Mishnah and Rashi, the Tanoim disagree as to the status of Balkari regarding Kriyat Shema and Shemon Esrei. According to Tanna Kama, Balkari may mentally recite Shema, but not any other brachos, since brachos are all obligations midrabanan. Because birchas hamazon is obligated midaraisa, one would recite it mentally. According to Rabbi Yehuda, a Balkari may recite even standard brachos that are obligatory midrabanan. Tosfos explains that according to the Tanna Kama, the reason why brachos, including birchos Kriyat Shema, may not even be contemplated mentally, while Shema may be contemplated, is because the obligation to recite Shema is midaraisa, as was discussed early in this volume, and the brachos are midrabanan. Says Toisus, Balkari mahar belibo ve'enu mevarech lo lefanev lachra, peirosh afilu behirhur, even thinking about it. Why are we more makel by Kriyat Shema than other brachos? Because the Kriyat Shema deraisa, brachos rabbanon, so we don't require the brachos to be said because it's only rabbinic. But Kriyat Shema is deraisa, so we require it.
This would be for Birchas Torah as well, because that's the Raisa.
That's right, yeah. And the other brachos must be referred. Yeah, the Einam of Arch Fanev Lachra referred to the Birchas Kriyat Shema. But yes, since Birchas Kriyat Shema are also be deraisa, l'chora it would apply as well, like Kriyat Shema.
Birchas Torah, the Raisa.
That's a Torah.
Yeah.
There's the two brachos that are midoraisa are Birchas Torah and Birchas Hamazon. All other brachos are midrabanan, including the Birchas Kriyat Shema. The Gemara in Brachos comments that Ezra's takana, requiring a Balkari to immerse, was later abolished, because according to the strict halacha, words of Torah cannot become tamei. Therefore, Balkari is permitted to verbalize words of Torah and daven normally. See, that's why I got a little, I think the footnote before that they got rid of it because they wanted the They didn't want people not to have marital relations with their wives. And people were going to be forgoing that. I thought that footnote would be more appropriate here, but let's see what they say here. Masechta Brachos, Armav Dach Bar Yitzchak, no Ga'alma, the minig practical is Krav ben Beser b'divrei Torah. Regarding speaking Torah as a Balkari, the Tanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Beser Omer, Ein divrei Torah makablim tuma. We know there's a concept in halacha of things that are makabel tuma. If something tameh, a sheretz, lands on a metal kli, for example, so a metal kli can be makabel tuma. So they're doing but what Rabbi Yehuda ben Beser is saying is divrei Torah cannot be makabel tuma. So the fact that a Balkari is uttering words of Torah, that's not a problem. Kiyasa ziri omer batlua litfilusa, that the halacha, where people had to go into the mikveh before they learned Torah, that was nullified. The Amri law batlua litilusa, some say they abolished washing of hands. Mandamar batlua litfilusa, Rav Yehuda ben Beseira. The one who said they were batal going to the mikveh was like Rav Yehuda ben Beseira, that you don't have to go to the mikveh prior to learning Torah. The Rambam rules in accordance with Rav Nachman, Yitzchak Rav Yehuda ben Beseira, that Tvilas Ezra was abolished. Rambam Hilchos Kriyas Shema. Kol atmeim chayavim b'Kriyas Shema. Just because you're tamei does not make you potter from Kriyas Shema, and you're obligated in Kriyas Shema. Umevarchin lefanev lachreya vein b'tumasa. You could also recite the brachos before and after. Aval b'shev shelen la'alus b'tumasa bo bayom. There are certain types of tumah that you can get rid of it right away. You can go to the mikveh, you can go to Nogeh B'Sheretz, or Benida V'Zava Umishkavan, a Nida or a Zava, they go to the mikveh, Umishkavan, V'Kayotze Behen. They can, for example, somebody who touches a Sheretz. So you go to the mikveh, you're a Tvul Yom. You need hair of Shemesh. You need the sun to go down to eat Truma, to eat Kodshim. If you touch Nevela, same din. Go to the mikveh that day, you're already at Tvul Yom, you can eat Meiser. You need hair of Shemesh for Truma and Kodshim. Any Tumah that emanates from a person's body, it's a Zav or a Zava, a Mitzora or your Ledes, those are all people who, if they have to count 7 clean days. Then on the 7th day, they go to the mikveh. They're Tvul Yom. At night, they become a hair of Shemesh. And they can eat Truma, but no Kodshim. On the 8th day, they were called Mechusar Kippur, and they had to bring a korban. Then they could eat Kodshim. A Tumas Mace, somebody who's in the room with a dead body or touched a dead body, is tummy for 7 days, needs Poraduma sprinkled on him on the 3rd and 7th day. He goes to the mikvah also on the 7th day. It's Tvul Yom. At that point, he can eat Meiser. Again, at night, that person needs hair of Shemesh. He can eat Truma and Kodshim. That just gives you the overview that the Rambam is trying to say here, that these people can at least be matar themselves on the level to eat Meiser that day. Just go to the mikvah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm sorry to go back, but does a sofer who's writing Sefer Torah, does he have to say Brachas HaTorah every time before he writes? Because the sofer often have the minhag of going to the mikveh every day before they do their work.
Yeah, but that's not so. That's
Is that having anything to do with this?
yeah. Bernie asked about a sofer, that they have a minute to go to the mikveh every day when they write a Sefer Torah. So that's the extra mila of kedusha that they want to have when they write a Sefer Torah. We'll have to see whether it's Meikar Adin or whether it's just a minhag
They
Chasidus.
say Brachas HaTorah when they're writing?
They say Birchas Torah in the morning, just like all of us, right? And then that would cover them for the writing of the Sefer Torah. You remember, if you're being magia Sefer Torah, like correcting a Sefer Torah, that's not learning Torah. Now, writing a Sefer Torah may be different. I think we covered in your day. We covered mezuzah and tefillin and Sefer Torah and all of that. We have to go look in that issue there. whether that the going to the mikvah is a minhag chasidus or whether it's me'ikar adin. I just don't know. But it's a good question. Ve'ezra beis dino tiknu shelo yikra bal keri levado min shar tmei mat sheyitvo. Ezra, they made a takana only about a balkari, not other tmeim. They didn't say, oh, if you're Tomei Sheretz or Tomei Nevela, you got to go to the mikveh before you learn. Ezra only made this takana about a balkari. However, lo parsha takana zu b'chol Yisrael. Rambam says this takana didn't spread. V'laya koch l'rovat tzibur lamud ba. The majority of the tzibur couldn't abide by that. Lefichach batla, it became abolished. Ukvar nagu kol Yisrael likros b'torah v'likros kriyas shema v'hein balei karyan. The standard minig now is for people to read Torah and read Kriyas Shema even though they're balkari. L'fishein divrei Torah mekablim tuma elo oimdim taros lo oilam. Words of Torah remain Torah forever. They can't become metame. And the Shulchan Aruch accepts the Rambam's ruling, according to which the enactment for balkari to immerse was abolished. Following the strict halacha, the divrei Torah cannot become impure. Kol atmeim korin b'Torah, the korin Kriyas Shema mispalim. Anyone who's tamei can read the Torah, can read Kriyas Shema, they can daven Shemona Esrei. Chutz mi balkari. Shotziu Ezra b'chol atmeim. Ezra sort of removed the balkari from the other people who become tamei. V'asru bein b'divrei Torah bein b'Kriyas Shema u'tfilat she'yitvo. Ezra's takana was that you cannot learn, read Kriyas Shema or daven Shemona Esrei until you went to the mikveh. Kedei, in fact, it's just the opposite of what I was learning. They didn't want, right? A Talmid Chacham, the Gemara says, has marital relations once a week, Friday night. That's the derech of a Talmid Chacham. And Enechanami, to sort of discourage relations. They made it onerous. I mean, if you were going to have relations every day, you'd have to go to the mikveh every day before you came to the yeshiva. So by having this rule, they were going to minimize marital relations. They didn't want the men to be with their wives like chickens. That's what the Rambam says. Because chickens are always, roosters and hens are always going at it, I guess. It says Eitzel Nishosem Ketar Nagolin. That's not the right midah to have as a Talmid Chacham. However, Achakach Batlo also Takana the midah of Aladin. They went back to the Ikar Adin, which all Tmein can learn Torah. Av Bal Keri Mutter B'divrei Torah V'Kriyas Shema V'Tfila B'Lo Tvila V'Lo Rechitza V'Tisha Kabin V'Chein Poshna Minig. That's the minig. Okay. According to Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, it seems that there's no reason for immersing nowadays, as the enactment was entirely nullified. And this is the accepted halach in most places. Nevertheless, the Mishnah Berurah mentions Anshe Maisa, conscientious people, are careful to go to the mikveh before they daven, or at least to pour 9 kabin of water upon themselves. Says the footnote, which Brachos 22b discusses the efficacy of pouring 9 kavs of water where immersion is not practical. The measure of 9 kavin equals approximately 12.5 liters, according to Rav Chaim Na'eh, and 22 liters according to Chazon Ish. Thus, showering for a few minutes can fulfill the requirement of pouring 9 kavin of water. You take a shower, then that you fulfill, that's certainly more than 12 liters or 22 liters when you take a shower. Okay? This is not the same din as, for example, immersing in a mikveh that can't be mayim she'uvim, right? Can't be carried water, right? But that pouring 9 kavin doesn't have the same restriction. Mikol Malkam Yeshan say Maisa, says the Mishnah Berurah. Shenohagim b'takon zu v'tovim l'tzatzman the karyan. They do go to the mikveh because they have their balkari. If they can't go to the mikveh, they wash themselves with 9 kav of water. Now, the Pischei Teshuvos goes further and suggests that since today there are modern clean mikveh facilities with hot water, it may remain an obligation for Baal Keri to immerse. I don't know where he came up with that. The Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, in their discussion of this, did not state that the reason that they abolished the takana was because it was inconvenient. They didn't have hot water. I don't know where we'll see where the Pischei finds this. Maybe he finds some sources. Ularabim min harishonim l'tfila v'lo ularabim min harishonim l'tfila lo bitlua. That the Rishonim did not abolish this takana when it comes to tefillah Shmona Esrei. See the Turim Beis Yosef, citing the Rif, who mentions this opinion as well as the Ravid, who holds that a Baal Keri must still wash himself off with 9 kabin of water, even if immersion is not customary. This approach can be fulfilled, according to most opinions, by taking a shower for a few minutes. So Ve'ein emet, back to the Pischei Teshuvah. Ve'ein emet ki achrat haTur v'Shulchan Aruch lahakel, that the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch eventually were lenient. Uvevadei Ruach HaKodesh nosasa b'hem. Of course, the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch had Ruach HaKodesh. Ki kama yoshvei kvarim haya shlohaya b'nimtza tachas yadam mikveh l'tfilah. That the people lived in these villages didn't have a mikveh, and they didn't have hot mikvos. There were no clean mikvahs. And it was also Northern Europe, and we call it Sinai Chashash Choili. People could get sick, the sakana. The majority of the people could not abide by this takana. If they would have said, oh, you can't learn Torah or daven because you're Baal Keri having nafik, it would have led to a massive destruction in Klal Yisrael. And also, people wouldn't have children with all of this. They would refrain from having relations, therefore they wouldn't have children. It was a mess. Throughout the generations, there was a great hakpada to go to the mikveh. Like we know people go to the mikveh before davening. Gloshna Rabbam, Be'igroisav, in his letters. Shahid al Atzma Shememav, Shemiyam Levobitel Tfilazu. The Rambam says himself that his whole life he never was Mavatal that Tfilah. He says, our generation, we have beautiful mikvahs, hot water. The Katean Kiyusatfei is very clean. He says, Yitachin Shechova hi mamish. It may revert back to an obligation. You should be makbid on this tefillah. The gam b'Shabbos. That a person is machmir, Hashem will lengthen his life. Nevertheless, as mentioned above, the widespread custom nowadays in most communities is not to require tefillah sezra. It's also the conclusion of Eliezer Melamed is Pninei Halacha, though he adds that even if it's not required, since every home today contains a shower, it is worthwhile to fulfill this practice by taking a shower, which is also hygienically appropriate. In reality, practically, he says, this minhag did not spread. So the Chachamim saw it wasn't accepted, so they abolished it. They went back to be matir somebody who had relations. There was no restriction. He notes that there are people who are machmer on themselves. Every house has a shower. Now, there's also a dominant custom for men to immerse in the mikveh before Yom Kippur. And this immersion stems also from this Takana Sezra. Page 236, Machshava. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liad, he writes the following as an introduction to the halachos related to maintaining cleanliness and spiritual purity during tefillah. Katuv b'Torah, v'Shabbos, v'Shavas, v'Chisisa es tzeyasecha. You shall return. This is talking about the holiness of the Machane Yisrael. When the Machane Yisrael encamped, so they had certain laws that when you go to the bathroom, kisisa tzeyasecha, you have to cover your excrement. Ki Hashem Elokecha misalech b'kerv machanecha, because Hashem is in the Machane. Vaya machanecha kadosh. The camp has to be holy. The lo yireh b'cha ervas davar v'shav me'acharecha. And there shouldn't be any erva there, because it would cause Hashem to turn away from you. Mikan lamdu chachamim in brachos chafei amid beis shebechol makom she'Hashem Elokeinu misalach imanu, whoever Hashem is with us. Dahainu kishanu oiskim b'kriyas shema v'tfilo v'divrei Torah. Hashem is with us. We are makabel all malchus shamayim during Kriyas Shema. So Hashem is with us then, and certainly during tefillah. We know Pirkei Avos says, Asara Shalomdim Torah Shechina Sharu Imohem. And then the Pirkei Avos goes, even one person. It brings you psukim that even one person by himself. So in all of these cases, the Shechina is there. So therefore, Tzarech Liyos HaMachaneh Kadosh. So where you are has to be in a holy environment. Shalot tehei tsoa megula sham. You can't have open dung. V'shlo devar erva neged panav shalom. And we've been dealing with erva, things that normally have to be concealed, k'molei in front of his eyes. The machaneh that a person has is anything in front of him or in front of his eyes or in front of his face. Shulchan Aruch Harav reminds us that Hashem is in close proximity to us when we daven or study Torah. Therefore, we must make the effort to maintain the proper physical and spiritual environment to allow for this closeness. That's a basic prerequisite for proper tefillah and Torah studies. Okay, before we move on to 243, anybody have any comment, question, ha'ara of any kind on the issue of erva? Okay, let's go on to 243, which we're going to go into the sugya of the zman for Kriyas Shema. In the previous volume, Shir 3, we learned about some of the zmanim related to the morning tefillah, including Alos HaShachar, Netzach Chama, and Mishiyakir. In this Shir, we will focus on the proper zman for reciting Kriyas Shema. Now, the earliest time for reciting Kriyas Shema is discussed in the Mishnah and Brachos, which we saw in the previous Shir on zmanim. When is the appropriate time to read Shema? When you can differentiate between the color of tcheles, which is like a blue, and white. Crazy is like a greenish blue. So, according to both opinions in the Mishnah, the earliest time for reciting Shema, known as Mishiyakir, is a time at which one can discern the difference between two colors, either blue and white, Tarakama, or tcheles and green, Rabbi Yezer. The Talmud Yerushalmi suggests that the opinion of the Tarakama, which is being able to differentiate between tcheles and white, is identical to the time when one can recognize an acquaintance at a distance of 4 amas, which is roughly 2 meters. So if you can recognize a person within 2 meters, so that there's enough light, that it's the time that you could read Kriyas Shema. As we will see shortly, this latter approach is attributed in the Gemara to Acherim. Says the Talmud Yerushalmi, Hu boy Meimar min demar bein ze'ev lekelev. One said that it's between a wolf and a dog. Bein chamor la'arod. An arod is a wild donkey. Kimin demar bein tcheles lekresim. These are all the same sort of criteria as between tcheles and leek. Umin demar kadeshi adam rochok mechaver arba amas umakira. The shear, which is arba amas, kimin demar bein tcheles alone. That equates to the tcheles and white. I'm going to read the footnote. More light is necessary to see things more clearly and to distinguish between things which are very similar. Therefore, according to the opinion, which holds that Mishiyakar is the time when one can discern between two similar animals, between tcheles and leek green, this time is relatively late, when there's a sufficient light on the horizon to see very subtle distinctions. According to the opinion of Mishiyakar is tcheles and white, which is easier to distinguish, or at a distance of 4 amos, Mishiyakar is relatively early, when there's very little light on the horizon. So the Gemara in Brachos in Bavli first clarifies the opinion of the Tanna Kama, explaining that between tcheles and white refers to differentiating between the tcheles strings on the tzitzis and the white strings on the tzitzis. The Gemara then offers 3 other opinions concerning which type of discernment becomes possible at the time of Mishiyakar. These 3 opinions are identical to the opinions mentioned in Yerushalmi in the previous source. Then in the final 2 sections of the passage we're going to bring, the Gemara presents 2 alternative rulings regarding the practical law. Says the Gemara in Brachos Tesomid Beis, my bein tcheles. What do we mean? The difference between tcheles and loven. Ilema bein gvava da amra chiyura the gvava da amra tchelta. That you have a pile of white wool and a pile of blue wool. Well, you'd be able to identify that even at night. We're talking about the strings that are on your tzitzis. So it's not a huge pile. It's one blue string and one white string. Tanya Reb Meir Omer. Mishiyakar ben ze'ev lekelev. You got to have enough light to distinguish between a wolf and a dog. Rabbi Kiva Omer ben chamor la'arod. Between a donkey and a wild donkey. That you can see your friend within arba amis. Which is the arba amis. The zman, as it relates to tefillin, is kacherim. But l'kriya shma is kivasikin. The people who were very pious, they would finish the bracha of Goel Yisrael with the rise of the sun, with Shkias HaChama, and then you would start Shmona Esrei. Taina Mahachi, Vasikin Ayugorim Osai Manetz HaChama. They would conclude Shema with its brachas. We'll see that's what it means, with the nates. And therefore, you're going to say the Shemon Esrei for sure in the daytime. You shall see God im shemesh v'liftei yerach dor dorim. That means you shall express awe of heaven right before sunrise, sort of with the coming of the sun. So towards the end of the passage, the Gemara cited 2 views regarding the concluding ruling. Number 1, Rav Huna held that the halacha falls acherim, which according to the Yerushalmi is also the opinion of the Tanna Kama, which is arba amos of recognizing your friend. While Abaye holds that regarding Shema, the halacha follows the Vasikim, who recited Shema right before sunrise. The approach of the Vasikin is then elaborated upon in the last section of our passage. The opinion of Abaye can be understood in one of 2 ways. The simplest understanding is that Abaye disagrees with Rav Huna and holds that the earliest time for reciting Shema is shortly before sunrise, but not earlier than that. So there he's clearly arguing with Rav Huna. Because Rav Huna says halacha kacherim that it's arba amos. Well, arba amos is going to be much earlier than shkia. But the second understanding is that Abai does not disagree with him. He also holds that the earliest time for reciting Shema is Mishiyakir. However, Abai adds that the ideal time to recite it is shortly before sunrise, as the Vasikin did. That means there's an earliest time, which might be earlier, but then there's an optimal time, which is when the Vasikin did it. The Rambam explains the opinion of Abai in the first manner, that the earliest time for reciting Kriyat Shema is shortly before Netzach Hama. That this is the opinion where he argues with Rav Huna, that Mishiyakir is much earlier, and Abai is coming to say, no, we don't agree with that, it's later, and the Rambam is going with that approach. Ve'ezo hizmana bayom. When is the time for Kriyat Shema on the date? The mitzvah sheyazchi likros kodem hanetzach hama, kidei sheyigmor likros ulevarech brachas achronim hanetzach hama. That you have to plan it. So you read Kriyat Shema and you recite the final bracha of Kriyat Shema, which is Goel Yisrael, right with the Netzach Hama. So the Rambam is holding that Abaya argues with Rav Huna. Now, Rabbeinu Yonah, the Rosh, and the Rashba understand Abai in the second manner, that he's not arguing. He agrees with Rav Huna, the halacha is like Achem, that the earliest time is Mishiyakir, which could be much earlier, but the optimal time is by the Netz. The Talmidei Rav Yoina, which are written in the Dapei Arif in Brachos Dadam and Beis, V'omer Mori Harav, she'afal pi shavasikin hayukorno so somech lanetzach hama, though even those people who did the Vasikin, they ended up reading Kriyat Shema later, near the Nades, they admitted that technically there was an earlier time that you could read it. Who set the criteria that as long as you could see your friend, Daladamas. Rav Huna, who was the later of those poskim, he ruled like that. Rabbeinu Yonah, as a Rishon, is showing us a different insight in Abaya than the Rambam, and really Abaya is not coming to argue. The Vasikin were very pious. They were careful in their mitzvahs. They wanted to connect the brach of Gal Yisrael to Shemona Esrei. They wanted to time it with the Nate. They would start Shemona Esrei right then. Mishiyakir is a little bit of time after Alos HaShachar, maybe an hour earlier. So they're saying, or 45 minutes earlier. So if they would have davened Mishiyakir, it would be a long time until they got to the Nates. They wouldn't be able to be soymech kulat film. Dokach hayutzrichli crosses soymech lanitzacham. Adam acher she'ena choishes smichas kulat film. Another person has to go to work early. It's not that important to him to be soymech kulat film, but he wants to read Kriyat Shema at the right time. So this explains very well the sheet in the Gemaras. The Rif may agree with I'm reading footnote 2. The Rif may agree with the position of the Rambam as well. It's somewhat similar but not identical position taken by a number of other Rishonim, including Rabbeinu Tam and the Baal Hamor. According to these Rishonim, Abaya's position is that sunrise is the earliest time for reciting Kriyat Shema, and that this is the halach as well. Now, the Geula L'Tfila, number 3, this refers to the notion of reciting Shemona Esrei immediately following the mention of the redemption of the Jews from Egypt. According to some opinions of the Gemara, this is required, and it's the accepted halacha. But we'll deal with that later in other shiurim. According to Rabbeinu Yonah, Abaya allows reciting the Shema from the time of Mashiachir. However, those Vasikin who recited the Shemona Esrei at sunrise refrained from reciting Kriyat Shema at the much earlier time of Mashiachir in order to do this juxtaposition of Shema and Tefillah. By the way, you can go back to volume 9 in Shir 3 for a review of some of the other Zmanim. We talked about Mashiach and Alos, and that was having to do with Birchas HaShachar. When is the first time and the Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with this approach as well. That Kriyat Shema may be recited after Mashiachir, but the ideal time to recite it is shortly before sunrise.
It's interesting that the Shulchan Aruch holds that way, because you've got the Rif and the Rambam, 2 out of the 3 follows, holding the other way, that it's only before sunrise. So in this is one case, the Shulchan Aruch didn't go after the majority, apparently.
Right. That's why I think there's a machlokas about what the Rif they brought. They say the Rif may agree with it. We have to learn up that carefully. That could be totally in this issue that Yaakov is bringing up, because maybe the Rif holds like the Rambam, maybe he doesn't. We'll see. The Shulchan Aruch says, "Man kriyat shema shel shachris mishiyiras chavero harogili moktsas." So you're right. The Shulchan Aruch is going like the Rabbeinu Yonah, not like the Rambam. Berichuk da'adamos v'yakirena. U'mitzvah min ha'muvcha likrosa k'vasikin. He does say that it's the optimal to read it like Vasikin. Shari mechavnin likrosa ma'at kodem ha'netzachama k'dei she'yisayim kriyat shema u'v'chosayim ha'netzachama v'yisbach ha'tfilah b'yad ha'netzachama. So the Shulchan Aruch says the optimal time is Vasikin, is to read your Kriyat Shema right before Nates, so that you get to Goal Yisrael with Nates. One could have understood that according to the Shulchan Aruch here, the distinction of the Vasikin is specifically the recital of Kriyat Shema immediately before sunrise. However, the Mishnah Berurah clarifies that the distinction of the Vasikin is specifically the recitation of Shemona Esrei, just as the day begins. And it is only because of this that Kriyat Shema is recited shortly before that time. The Mishnah Berurah then cites the logic offered by Rabbeinu Yonah in explaining why Kriyat Shema should not be recited earlier than that. That the beginning of Shemona Esrei is the Nates. From the pasuk Yirauchem Shemesh, if we would have read Kriyat Shema, right? There would have been a huge time gap between when he read the Kriyat Shema and the Nates. He'd have to wait. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying here, really, it's because Shemona Esrei has to be placed by the Nates. So then the Kriyat Shema has to be read a little bit before it. It's not like the Kriyat Shema has anything to do with it. It's really the Shemona Esrei. Although the primary recommendation to daven Vasikin relates to the Shemona Esrei, the Shulchan Aruch writes that nevertheless, everyone should ideally try to recite Kriyat Shema early, even when not davening Vasikin. Im lo kara osa kodem hanetzachama, yeshu lahagdim likrosa b'meira kol ma sheyuchal. The Shulchan Aruch seems to be saying that the earlier you read Kriyat Shema, the better it is. The Mishnah Berurah qualifies that the injunction to recite Kriyat Shema early does not apply if one would need to daven alone without a minyan. In such a case, one may wait to recite Kriyat Shema and daven together with the minyan later, assuming it is before the latest time. However, he notes that it is not proper to organize a minyan to begin close to the end time for Kriyat Shema. What he's saying is, it's still more preferential to daven with a minyan, even though that minyan is going to be much later than this early time, right? The Shulchan Aruch seems to be saying, if you're not one of these Vasikin people that are going to daven close to the Nates, the earlier you daven, the better, Kriyat Shema. But says the Mishnah Berurah, that's not if your minyan is later than, let's say, Nates. Then you should wait, as long as your minyan is not 10 minutes before The end zman, says the Mishnah Berurah. Lahagdim, dizrizim magdim lemitzvahs. He explains the Shulchan Aruch's law that by doing it earlier, you're fulfilling zrizim. But don't make the mistake of davening by yourself, as opposed to with a minyan, a likros below tefillin. Let's say you don't have your tefillin by that time. This was, I guess, the countries in the Bnei Ashkenaz, Germany, Poland, they would recite their Kriya Shema very late. And the whole purpose of creating the world is just to be Makabal Shemayim. It seems that later minyanim are still common today in many places due to the influence of electricity, which enables people to go to sleep much later at night and are not assumed to be halachically problematic, provided Kriya Shema is recited in time. One can defend the custom by noting that the main reason for reciting Shema early is Rizim Magdimim Lemitzvahs, which is a Lechatchila principle, but it does not obligate one to recite it very early, and one not need necessarily alter his entire daily schedule in order to accommodate it. In addition, the custom of beginning Shachos later on Shabbos morning is even mentioned in the Ramah. So, page 249. According to what we have seen so far, one should not recite Kriya Shema before the time of Mishiyakir, the calculation of which was discussed at length in volume 9, Shir 3. Nevertheless, Rabbeinu Yonah and other Rishonim hold that when necessary, one may recite Kriya Shema earlier, as long as it's after Alos HaShachar. By the way, we have the same thing regarding tzitzis and tefillin. It's really, you should put on tzitzis and tefillin also after Mishiyakir. But we had the same issues. If you had to do it earlier, you can do it earlier, but it's got to be after Alos. The absolute minimum is Alos HaShachar. It cannot be read before that. The Shulchan Aruch also rules that Kriya Shema may be recited after Alos HaShachar when necessary. Mishahu onus. He's got a problem. If you're going to try a mashkim lotzis saderech, he's got to travel early. B'makom dudei chayv listim, where there's wild animals. He wouldn't have time to stop there and to have kavana. So he's got to daven before he leaves. Or the caravan is already leaving. You can read Kriya Shema with its brachos after Alos. The kivin sha'ala amud hashachar, shaper karina be uvekumecha, v'gam shaper mikra yotzei or. Remember, in Birchas Kriya Shema we say yotzei or, so after Alos you could technically say that. Aval imenu b'makom g'dudei chayv listim. You're not an onus. V'gam ein b'nei asher nispazim kolcha. Afilu yotzei derech achar sha'ala amud hashachar. Ein akar achshegit. You should wait until the proper zman. The Mishnah Berurah brings onus. Hu adin kisheyesh kvuras meis be'ir. Let's say there's a funeral, or mila, or yom areva the mavshi barachmin. It's Hoshana Rabbah, where we got to daven very early, right? You can read Kriya Shema once there's Alos HaShachar. Mashkim, he doesn't have the time to wait until Mishiyakir. He has to travel. And the Sephardic posting like Mordechai Eliyahu says the same thing. According to Mishnah Berurah, some opinions do not allow reciting Kriya Shema before Mishiyakir. Therefore, it's still preferable to wait, if possible, Mishiyakir, even if you're pressed for time, so that he may don tefillin with a bracha and recite the Birchos Kriya Shema according to all opinions. Let us apply these principles to a common case of davening shachris early in the morning during the winter months, when sunrise is relatively late, and must take special note of the earliest times. As an illustrative example, below are the times for Alos HaShachar, Mishiyakir, And on eights for a typical day at the beginning of January in New York and Antwerp. So January 3rd, 2022, Alos was 5:52. Rishiyakir is 6:25, which we said is the same Zman to say Kriyat Shema. And Nate's was 7:20. Sunrise was 7:20. Boy, that was pretty late in New York. Okay. We're gonna stop here, and we're gonna go to the latest time, which is usually much more relevant for a lot of us. And how do we calculate the halal, the zmanim properly? And we will also next week, if we get to it, begin the zman for Shemona Esrei as well. Any other questions or haros or?